Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. We're glad that you all could join us. My name is Virginia Berkenkotter. We have about 30 minutes of content that we're going to go through and present for you today. And then we have some Q&A time left at the end. And so we really hope that you're going to be able to ask some of your questions. And you're going to be able to do that in the GoToWebinar post. But certainly if you have questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and put them in there and we will get that to them at the end. My name is Virginia Berkenkotter. I'm the Delivery Director over the Higher Education practice here at ACF Solutions. And I have the privilege of working with our delivery team as well as our clients, helping them to achieve their objectives both in Salesforce and the ecosystem. I've spent my entire career working in higher education and information technology, so I'm well versed in many of the challenges that colleges and universities have implementing and maintaining technology to support their mission and vision. And I'm also joined by Hamlett. Watt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, Hamlett. I'm a solution architect with ACF. I've been in technology and nonprofit world for about 15 years now, and here at ACF I support both our higher ed and nonprofit teams in doing solution design on Salesforce.
Thanks, Watt. All right, so before we begin today, I want to tell you just a little bit about ACF Solutions and who we are. We're very proud to be a Salesforce Silver Consulting partner. We are Salesforce.org preferred partner. We work exclusively with higher education and nonprofit. We've been doing this for about 13 years, which I think in the .org world is about as long as anyone else out there. We've also completed over 600 Salesforce implementations for some of the clients like you see here. And we very much pride ourselves on taking on big, complex technical projects. Most recently, you may or may not have heard that we're excited to now be part of Attain. This acquisition took place in October. And along the way of our 13-year journey, we've been able to help many of our clients navigate the complexities of deciding whether one org or multiple org is the best decision for them. So today, we'd like to share with you a little bit about what we've learned and some key considerations for you to think through as you're making this decision. All right. So that's a little bit about us, but now we'd like to learn a little bit about you, if that's okay. So if you could please look at the screen, there should be a quick poll. There you go. And just so we can better understand our audience, if you could answer this question, how many Salesforce orgs do you have today? And it could be that you have not implemented one, that you have one, many, or you may not even be sure, and that's great too. Just give you a minute to fill that out. Okay, thank you. All right, great. So it looks like we have a really good mix across the board. So I think that you're going to find this presentation very useful. All right. There we can see our results. Thank you very, very much. Can everyone see that? All right, great. So here's the question that we're going to try and tackle today. What is the right number of orgs? And the answer is as few as possible, but as many as necessary. Now, this may seem counterintuitive to many of you. In fact, I often have clients say, wait, I thought it was always best to only have one org. Why would I ever want more? And on the surface, this may appear to be true, but for your specific institution or use case or implementation needs, it may not be possible, practical, or even desirable to do this. It might be very challenging to combine functions and departments into a single Salesforce org. And really it goes back to just because you could doesn't mean that you always should. So today we're going to look at how do you know when you can and whether you should. And that's really the heart of our presentation. But I do want to just give fair warning right now that we're probably not going to definitively answer this for all of you that may be either reevaluating where you're at or trying to determine what's the best approach. But we're rather going to give you some key questions to help you go back to your institutions and ask to make an informed decision about what path to go down. And now I'm going to turn it over to Watt, who's going to talk us through many of the considerations that will help to determine this. Watt?
Thanks, Virginia.
Sure.
So before we dig into looking at the considerations, it's helpful to just take a minute and think about why this question about number of orgs is even an issue when it comes to Salesforce. And we see that there are generally two contributing factors to this. The first one is Salesforce is cool. It's typically way better than all the old clunky technology that we've been using before. It's better than spreadsheets. It's in the cloud, so we can use it from anywhere. We can get it on our phone. We've got great dashboards, so we can visualize our data, and we can use workflow to send us notifications about tasks that we have to do. And then there's all this innovation that's happening, both through all the Salesforce releases and in the AppExchange ecosystem. So for a lot of us who came to Salesforce, we came to it in the context of a single set of needs. We needed a system that was going to help us fundraise, or we needed a system that was going to help us manage corporate relationships or manage programs. And so in that context, we saw Salesforce, we liked it, we bought it, we implemented it, and we often did so without giving much thought to the fact that there may be others in our organization who might want Salesforce too, or maybe we didn't even know that others in our organization already had Salesforce. So because of how compelling Salesforce is, I say it's cool, and I think it is, but it's very compelling. Different parts of the organization often go off, discover it on their own, and kind of do their own thing. And so in that situation, what often happens is you get a single organization or institution that has multiple versions of Salesforce, and so the question arises, should we have all these orgs? Should we have fewer? So that's one factor. And then the second factor is that Salesforce is broad and flexible. So there's so much that you can now do with the Salesforce platform. You can, of course, do sales and sales-like things, relationship management and fundraising and so forth. You can do services or case management. You can do marketing. You can have communities. And then there are all these features built into Salesforce that make it possible to have people who do very different things within your institution all using the same org. I mean, think about things like custom objects, where you can create your own unique data types to manage things that are unique to your needs or your business process. You can create lots of different types of record types and page layouts, so different people using the system can have a user experience that is tailored to what they do. You can set up roles and profiles so that people can have different levels of access to the same data, and you can use things like Chatter to help people collaborate. So with Salesforce, we have a single system that can possibly be used across all of these different areas of our department or our school or our organization. So Salesforce is cool, and because of the cool factor, sometimes organizations end up with many orgs when maybe they should just have one. And because Salesforce is so broad and flexible, sometimes institutions end up with one org when maybe they should have many. So how do you know? How do you know when is the right approach to have a single org and when it's better to have many orgs? So to help address that question, there are three key areas of consideration that you want to think through in your own situation to help shine light on that. And those three areas are, first, your operating model. So this has to do with the relationship between the various entities that are going to be using Salesforce within your organization or institution. The second are a set of technical considerations. These really have to do with the Salesforce product itself, what it's capable of doing, what its limitations are. And then the third set of considerations are organizational, things about your particular situation, the people, the priorities, the budget, the timeline, and what's going to be most practical and make the most sense for you, for where you are today, and then where organizationally you want to go. So we're going to take a look at each of these consideration areas now through the remainder of our presentation. So first is your operating model. And this concept of an operating model framework comes out of the MIT Sloan Center for Information Systems Research and the 2006 book Enterprise Architecture as Strategy. So if we forget about Salesforce for just a second, the basic idea of this MIT Sloan framework is that your IT systems and strategy should align as much as possible with your operating model. So if you understand your operating model, that can go a long way towards helping you understand the right IT systems approach. So the team at Sloan developed the framework that you see on the right here that identified 4 basic operating models within the corporate world, and then the IT strategies that would align best with those operating models. So what we have done for today is we've taken that MIT Sloan model and we have adapted it to more align with how nonprofits and higher ed do what they do. And so that gives us the model that you see on the screen now. And so let me kind of lay out how this framework works, and then we'll talk about the implications for your Salesforce org strategy. So across the bottom axis, this is about your processes, standards, and governance as an organization or institution, with the range here from different to same. So to put this in a Salesforce context, for the parts of your organization that will be using Salesforce, how different or similar are they in terms of what they do and how they do it? And then on the left-hand side, the axis here is about your constituents, again with the range from different to same. So again, in a Salesforce context, for the parts of your organization that will be using Salesforce, to what extent are they relating to the same set of constituents, and to what extent are they relating to different constituents? So again, across the bottom, this is about what you do and how you do it. And then along the side, this is about who you do it for or who you do it with. So this gives us now a nice 2x2 grid that lets us look at the 4 different operating models. So we're going to start here in the upper right in the situation where, in terms of processes and standards, things are more or less the same. What we do, how we do it is the same. And in terms of the constituents we work with, those are the same as well. So in this framework, if that describes your operating model, then your IT strategy would be one of unification in the MIT Sloan terminology. So when it comes to Salesforce then, if everybody who needs to use Salesforce is either doing the same kind of things with the same group of people or operating under the same basic standards or governance, then you should probably think in terms of a single Salesforce org as possible. So a use case here would be where you're using Salesforce just for a single function within your organization, like fundraising or advancement, or just within a single school. And if you're a nonprofit, if your organization and mission is simple and focused enough, this could be the right approach. So going now to the opposite corner here, if across the parts of your organization that would be using Salesforce, you're doing fundamentally different things, and you're doing them for or with different people, then this would imply an IT strategy of diversification, where you may be better served by separate, independent Salesforce orgs. So an example here within higher ed would be where you want to use Salesforce, or you're using Salesforce across your graduate business school, your undergraduate advising, and tech transfer. So in those 3 areas, there's no real overlap in terms of processes or constituents. So all else being equal, you may be better off in separate independent orgs. Or if you're a very large nonprofit where you have a lot of complex processes, but there's really no overlap between, let's say, your constituents, the people who give or advocate on behalf of your organization, and then your clients, or the people that you serve, or if you're serving animals or nature, et cetera, then you could also be served by this org model of diversification. So let's move over to the right here and ask the question, well, what if we are working with different constituents, but we're largely doing the same kinds of things? So that takes us to the 3rd strategy, called replication. So the example here is where you would want to roll out Salesforce for student services, but across multiple campuses. Or if you're a nonprofit, where you'd want to roll out Salesforce capabilities, but to multiple chapters. So as with diversification, you're probably better off with multiple orgs. But the difference here is that you'd want to have multiple versions of the same org. So I've tried to represent that through the color coding here to say, yes, like diversification, it's still separate orgs, but those orgs are set up to be more or less configured the same. But because there's no overlap in constituents, there's really no additional benefit in having everybody operating out of the same org. So that leaves us with our fourth quadrant here. So this is the situation where we're doing all different kinds of things across the areas that we want to use Salesforce, but we're ultimately doing it for the same set of constituents. So this is the strategy known as coordination. And again, similar to diversification, it's probably going to make sense to have different separate Salesforce orgs, but the key here is that you're going to need some way to tie those orgs together, and that's what this blue arrow is designed to represent. Some way to connect the data between those orgs so that, because again you're serving the same set of constituents, you can get a more complete picture of who those constituents are across your different functions, and if your constituents are interacting with you in any way, that they can have a more seamless experience in interacting with your organization or institution. So the typical use case here in higher ed would be what we would call enterprise higher ed, which is where you want to do full student life cycle things in Salesforce, like recruiting and admission and student services, and you want to do fundraising, and you want to use Salesforce for various program centers. And again, in the nonprofit sector, I think of an organization like the Red Cross that has very distinct kinds of business functions. The Red Cross has their blood services, they have their disaster relief, they have their health and safety work, which is swim lessons and things like that, all very different types of activities and business processes, but ultimately spanning the same set of constituents. So again, using this MIT framework, we get some sense of what an org strategy would be based upon different operating models for institutions or organizations. One thing I'll just say here is that even though this is a grid, so there are solid black lines between each of these quadrants, in reality, these are not necessarily going to be hard and fast boundaries, but maybe more of a spectrum. So your institution or the way you're set up to operate may be mostly one way, but also a little bit another way. And so there still can be some gray area that you'll have to work through to figure out the right org strategy. So that takes us beyond looking at operating model to the second set of considerations, which are our technical considerations. So again, these are things about Salesforce itself, about the product, to be aware of as you weigh your options. And these could be considerations that sway you to one org approach or another, or once you have chosen an org approach, these are things you'll need to be aware of and contend with based on the choice that you made. And at the risk of oversimplifying, what we've done here is we've assessed the level of difficulty of supporting these various functional or technical needs with a single org versus many orgs. So where you see green, that means the function is relatively easier to support, yellow is moderately difficult, and red is hard. And where you see both, so for example, half yellow, half red, that's a way to indicate that depending on your particular situation, it could either be one way or the other. Okay, so let's start here in the single org column and just go through a few of these to see how this tends to work out. So for example, if you're trying to achieve a 360-degree view of your constituent within Salesforce, probably most people would say, yeah, that's a no-brainer. If you're in a single org and all your constituent data is in one place, that's going to be easier to do, right? And then if your Salesforce data about your constituents is across multiple orgs, but you're still trying to get a consolidated view of who they are, then it's not impossible to do that, but it's going to require some extra work in terms of, again, doing some integration or at least some work with analytics. Same story with staff collaboration. So if everyone is in a single org, you can turn on chatter, and people from all parts of your institution can collaborate with one another around your data and your constituents. That's very hard to do if you're in separate orgs, right? But then on the other hand, staff collaboration may not be a primary driver for you or may not be a high priority. So in that case, it's not as significant a consideration. So moving on down the list here, similar story with shared communities or centralized constituent services. If all of your data is in a single org and you want to have a community where your constituents can interact with you, it's much easier to do than if that same constituent data lives across multiple orgs. That can actually be quite difficult to set up a community and have constituents interacting with data that's across multiple orgs. Enterprise level reporting, again, similar story for a single org. If all your data is in one place, it sure is a lot easier to report on versus if it lives across different Salesforce orgs. So then we get into a few situations where the degree of difficulty can be different depending on whether you're looking at things only at the level of a Salesforce org or whether you're looking more broadly across systems at your institution or organization. So let's take this example of licensing and paying for and maintaining apps within your Salesforce org. If you're in a single org, that's relatively straightforward to do. If you have many Salesforce orgs, it's also relatively straightforward to do at the level of each org. But let's say you're in central IT, and so you're responsible for maintaining systems across the entire institution. Now, if you have all of these different orgs that are independently licensing and having to maintain and update Salesforce apps, now that's become more challenging at the institutional level versus if everything was in a single org. Similar story with duplicate management, although a little bit in reverse here. So at the org level, if you're in a single org and have a lot of functions, a lot of different types of users in a single org, then you've got a lot of users who are inputting data. You maybe have a lot of online forms that are feeding data into your org. You might have a lot of integrations that are putting data into your org. So now there's a much more likely chance that you're going to get duplicate records created. So it's going to be more challenging to create a strategy for managing those duplicates and resolving them at the org level with a single org. But looking at it from the institutional point of view, once you've solved that duplicate management in that single org, you've really solved it for the institution. Versus if you have many separate orgs, dealing with duplicates within inside of each org can be relatively straightforward. But at the institutional level, you haven't really solved the problem, right? So you still have to figure out, if I've got duplicate data that lives across orgs, how do I get to kind of a single picture of truth for each person I'm relating to? Okay, so that's a lot, right? That's a lot of technical considerations to take into account. And if you just looked at this one slide and you kind of squinted your eyes and you might say, well, I see more green in the single org column than in the multi-org column. So I'm guessing by and large, it's better to have one org than many orgs. But what you don't know yet is that this is just slide 1 of 2. So when I go to the second slide, now you'll see, 1, great, there are more technical considerations I have to think about, but then 2, the advantages really reverse here, okay? So, so let's take a look, for example, at the area of centralized marketing. So let's say you want to connect Salesforce with Salesforce Marketing Cloud. You're going to have a much easier time doing that if you're in a single org. And in fact, up until recently, it wasn't even technically possible to connect Marketing Cloud with multiple Salesforce orgs. Now that is an option, but it's still not necessarily easy to do. And if you're using something like Pardot, that today is only good to connect to a single Salesforce org. So again, a little bit better situation with a single org. But then you get into things like creating a tailored user experience. You know, within a single org, yes, you can use profiles and record types to control the user experience, but many settings in Salesforce are org-wide, things like your tab names and your field names and your help text. So you're going to have to make some compromises to choose terminology for those things that are going to work for everyone. And this just becomes harder as more and more things are being done within a single org. Similar story there with data sharing and security. Again, if you've got a very complex data security model and you're trying to do that within a separate org, that's going to be harder to do than if each entity is in a separate org. But again, if you're going to be relatively open with data sharing across all the functions, then that's really not as significant a consideration for your situation. Then you always have to keep in mind org limits. So the more you try to do in a single org, the more you're going to run up against limits that Salesforce sets. Things like the number of fields you can have on each object you create, the number of values you can have inside of a pick list, the number of API calls you can make. There's even an obscure limit we ran into recently related to namespaces, which can arise when you have more than 10 apps installed that all get referenced by a single object. So if you go to save a contact record and it has to reference more than 10 installed Salesforce apps, you'll get an error, right? So there are lots of these kind of limits that you have to be more diligent and careful in working around the larger and more complex your Salesforce org becomes. And then the last one I'll call out here is around what I call data model or core package. And this often turns out to be one of the biggest deciding factors in a single org versus many orgs. So let's say, back to that situation where you want to do both student lifecycle management in higher ed as well as advancement on Salesforce. So typically, clients make use of what we would call a core app for each of those functions, but the reality is those apps are not as compatible with one another as we'd like them to be. So there can be some challenges there in getting those apps to play nicely within a single org. And there are other things you can kind of fall into that category as well. So let's say you want to be able to use opportunity records to represent any type of anything financial that's going on inside your Salesforce org. But if you have people who are collecting money for program fees, along with people who are collecting money for course enrollments, along with people who are collecting money for donations, now if all of that is inside a single opportunity object, then you're going to have to be more careful in sorting out and making sure you're counting the right money in the right category. So again, the kind of data model that you have to create to be able to satisfy everyone's needs can be a lot more challenging, and often the core packages that are designed to help with that don't play as nicely as ideally they would. So, what's the takeaway here with the technical considerations? I'd say first, again, there are a number of them that you'll have to weigh within your situation. And again, whether a single org or many orgs is easier or better really comes down to what things are most important to you in the ways you're going to use Salesforce. And so again, how do you begin to navigate this complexity and sort of make these decisions within your organization? And we're gonna share some thoughts about best practices at the end to help give you some guidance on how to tackle these topics inside your setting. But before we do that, let's move on to our third area, which is organizational considerations. And I'm going to hand it back over to Virginia.
All right. Thanks so much, Watt. So we're going to look at some organizational considerations. And there's a saying that you may or may not have heard. This says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And we at ACF think this applies to the kind of organizational considerations that are involved when looking at developing an organization strategy. So in this case, going fast may mean doing it separately in multiple orgs, as you can see from the green under the right-hand column. Or going far could be represented as doing a single org model that may present more challenges organizationally. And so we've looked at operational and we've looked at technical. And this is really the reality or gut check area. So on paper, you may look like absolutely a single org based on what we learned from the Sloan model and the technical and operational considerations. But here we need to assess, can your organization pull it off? And so these are those areas that we need to look at to determine that. So budgeting. There are significant budget impacts depending on which way you move forward with your org model. For instance, if each org unit goes out and buys its own org, it's really clear who's paying for it, who's covering the licenses as well as procuring third-party applications. But with a single org, you have to get budget from multiple stakeholders to align. You may need to establish a cost-sharing model as well as secure funds for the oversight of the org. Within the implementation, consolidating into a single org makes that there are a lot more choices that need to be made. You need to determine who goes first, for instance, what departments, features, and functions will be onboarded first into the org, and then who wins if there are competing needs. It's also going to require a lot of compromise from your business units and departments for the good of the entire organization. And there's also going to be a lot more dependencies over time that you'll need to take into consideration. Some departments also, if someone goes first, someone always has to go last, and there needs to be management and oversight to ensure that everybody's benefiting from the org. Another organizational consideration is the administration. We talked a little bit about who wins, but there are going to be competing needs, and your administrators are going to have to know how to support this. The effort to manage and maintain the org does become more complex. For instance, should a feature be enabled? Should a feature not be enabled? What value should appear in a pick list? And what will the hover help text say as a user hovers over it? In addition, you may not be able to evolve as rapidly in Salesforce or to tailor everything as much as you may like for specific users. And as you do onboard more units, and even as Salesforce releases new releases, you're going to have to do more regression testing for each and every release and feature and function that you put out there. So change management and data governance. These also increase in complexity when you're looking at everything into a single org, and you need to plan early for how these are going to be handled and make sure that you have buy-in from the top to support these. And lastly, culture. You know your organization, and you know whether your culture will support a single org, having multiple people from across the organization in the org every single day, and especially how this will affect your admins. Certainly you can build fairly invisible walls between daily users, but the admins will have to live in the same virtual space, and they'll need to be considerate of each other if you have multiple admins supporting those functions. And also take into consideration, what if an admin from one department does something, whether it's by accident or on purpose, that negatively may impact another department? You needed to understand how that will be perceived and how flexible and your users will be and how quickly that can be reverted. So those are some organizational considerations that we would want you to look at, as well as the technical and operational. So what do you do next? How do you get there? And that's where we're going to take a look at some best practices to support making this decision, in addition to looking at all that we've talked about. Okay, thanks, Watt. Start with a roadmap. We very much highly recommend you doing this up front before your implementation. This is something that we do with a lot of our clients, and it proves invaluable. So regardless of whether you're thinking one org or many, it's important to put a plan in place. And what a roadmap does is it brings together the right stakeholders to work through many of these considerations we've just talked about. A roadmap typically consists of putting a plan in place for a phased implementation, where you're going to determine what functionality will be implemented for what departments. You also take a look at your data governance, your change management, and certainly the org strategy. And it's really during this piece that we take a hard look at the organizational challenges and make sure that processes and a plan is put in place to support and mitigate what may come down the road. And another really good point here is that it's very difficult to consolidate multiple orgs or split a single org out after you've gone down the road of implementing. It's time consuming and costly, so it's really important to do this up front, and the roadmap will help support you in that. Another key best practice is to keep the entire enterprise architecture in view. Salesforce is just one part of your whole system landscape, and you want to make sure that you're planning effectively around all of the integration points and systems that are going to either be impacted, integrated with, or replaced at the enterprise level. Focus on governance. I don't know, but most of the places that I've had the privilege of working, there have been some politics, and I think that we all know that that comes, and we need to take into consideration those political challenges when into consolidating data, whether it's in a single org or even sharing data across org. Focusing on governance early and getting a model in place, or even a center of excellence that we'll talk about in a minute, will help discuss these challenges and put in place a governance model that can support the institution and work for everyone, from the executives all the way down to your end users. And next is a center of excellence. This is a body of key decision makers and stakeholders that will either coordinate and support the features and functions in a single org, or across multiple orgs. They help maintain best practices, the reference architecture, and coordination of integrations. They'll also help with planning and onboarding of additional functions and features. And lastly, keep up on the evolving Salesforce world. The technologies and within Salesforce are ever changing, as are the apps in their ecosystem, and it's really important to stay abreast of new functionality that's coming that may support your institution. Some new capabilities, for instance, Wave and Salesforce Connect, may make your situation better and may help to support the decision that you're going to make around your orgs. Other times you may be on the hub within the community, and a client will run into a challenge that they had not anticipated and you certainly had not, and it's going to shed some light on what you may face down the road. And it's also a great way to reach out and stay connected with your fellow higher eds and nonprofits. So with that, those are the best practices that we recommend, and that brings our presentation to a close. We hope that you found this helpful. We are certainly here to answer any of your questions. In fact, I've already seen a couple come through, but if you have any, please feel free to go ahead and type those in the question section. All right, so let me go ahead and ask our first one here. Okay. The question is, are there good apps that facilitate chatter across orgs? Passport Social Connector, for instance.
Yes. That Passport is the one that that I am familiar with, and you know, from what I've read about it, it does do what it purports to do, which is making cross-org chatter possible. You know, there are some limitations to that, and also it's not necessarily, you know, just completely a point and click to get started. There's some decisions you have to make around you know, how the chatter is going to work with different types of users, and if you've got groups, you know, being able to sync groups and things like that. So yes, there is a solution out there for it, and you know, I don't know that we've worked with it directly, but certainly from the things I've read about it, it does seem to be you know, to do what it advertises to do. So I would be interested to know if anybody on the call has had experience with Passport and has thoughts about it. But yeah, again, I think when we talked about staff collaboration, we talked about that as one of the things that's more challenging with multiple orgs, and something like Passport could be a way to help bridge that.
Thanks, Watt. Okay, we have another question that just came in. If you are implementing multiple orgs, is it best to implement one, then the other, or implement at the same time? And I unfortunately think the answer to this one might be it depends. If there is cross-org integration that needs to happen, or if they're going to be completely standalone, and they could be, if they're completely separate, they could be done at the same time or separately, depending on your budget and resources. To have them integrated, there would need to be crossover configuration and build at the same time to support that. So you would need to do some implementing at the same time. Want, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yes, that's a good question. I would agree that it does depend. I think in some situations you may having multiple orgs may be a better route, but you may have some users who actually need to operate across more than one org. Again, that's not ideal, but sometimes that's the best option. And so thinking about something like that, right? And the point that you go live, is it important to have both orgs or all the orgs available simultaneously? Could be a consideration as well. But I would say just in general, kind of back to the best practices that Virginia outlined. That's certainly something you'd want to address within a roadmap. So recognizing that probably some of you already have more than one org, and so you don't and they were created before you had a roadmap, so you don't necessarily have the luxury of starting from scratch. But if you do, I'd say that's definitely a topic to work through within your roadmap to decide the right sequencing or timing of when you're going to release each of the orgs.
Okay, thanks, Watt. We have another question. If we go with multiple orgs, what is the best way to share information between them in the collaborative model that you talked through?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and in fact, we had thought about maybe even kind of getting into that in this webinar, and the more we talked about that topic, we realized that's really almost a topic for its own separate hour of discussion. Yes. I'd say there's a whole spectrum of integration options that would range from no integration at all. I mean, sometimes you truly may be able to to have orgs that are completely standalone, even if you do have other orgs beyond that need to be integrated, right? So you don't necessarily always have to have integration, but more often than not, you're probably going to want to. And then when you sort of move into what are the options for doing that, it really should be driven by what are the results or the outcomes you're trying to achieve. Sometimes really what you need is just some data analysis. You don't necessarily need to be able to open one Salesforce org and see all of the data from another Salesforce org. What you really need to be able to do is do some higher level reporting of that data to understand overall totals or trends of things that you're trying to measure within your organization. So sometimes just a reporting or analytics strategy can be enough, but where you need to do more by way of true integration, again, there's sort of a range of options from just simply moving files back and forth between orgs. You can certainly use Salesforce's APIs and middleware to connect orgs to one another. I think Salesforce Connect now offers an interesting option where you can see data from one Salesforce org inside of another Salesforce org without actually having to move that data there. Again, it's kind of a it depends option. And all of those have associated costs and budget implications and implementation and licensing implications. So it's really going to be a matter of looking at which is the approach that best meets your needs and makes the best use of the resources you have available.
All right, thanks, Watt. So this is a great question. From a strictly licensing cost perspective, what are the implications of a single versus a multiple org? For example, is having 12 orgs more expensive than a single org? If so, is there a rule of thumb as to the difference in cost? Yeah, that's a.
I mean,
go with that one?
the way that Salesforce is licensed, of course, is a per user. So just with that, just thinking about that cost factor alone, whether you've got 100 users in one org or 10 users across 10 orgs, just from from just a Salesforce license point of view, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of difference there. I think where some of the other licensing costs tend to come in is things like data storage, for example. Depending on your data volumes, if you're piling up a lot of data inside a single org, you may have to start paying for extra storage that maybe you could get around if you had different orgs. And then in terms of apps you're licensing, right? Let's say you're using like Conga or some app like that for document merging. You're going to pay for each org that you have that in. So the fewer orgs you have, the fewer of those kinds of additional app licensing costs you may have. But again, some apps are just user-based, so there really wouldn't be a big impact one way or another. So I don't know, Virginia. Those are some of my thoughts. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to go. It depends. I think when you're talking about multiple orgs too, and if there's really deep integration that needs to happen, there's a cost associated with that to build that, depending on what tool you use and the resources that you need. That would be the only other area I was going to touch on from the multiple orgs. And then if you need to consolidate that data perhaps outside of those orgs into a data warehouse or a reporting solution, that's an additional cost that you would need to take into consideration.
Right.
So here is a question, speaking of reporting. If you're just looking at the reporting strategy, what would be the best way to connect the orgs to enable that?
Mm-hmm.
And we could certainly talk about tools that support reporting across multiple sources that can be seen in Salesforce. I don't know if they're talking about needing it within Salesforce.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely related to integration strategy as well. So for example, one approach would be that if you have many orgs, you pick one of the orgs that's going to be your reporting org, and then you work on getting all of the key data that you want to report on into that one org, and use that org to generate kind of your cross-org reports from. And in some cases, that org may be one of your operational orgs that you're also using for just for day-to-day business needs, or it could actually just be an independent org that you've just set up for that kind of data consolidation purpose. Now, of course, Salesforce offers their own external reporting tool, Wave Analytics, where you could, again, consolidate data from multiple Salesforce orgs as well as even other external systems to do that kind of data analysis. And there are other tools on the marketplace, other kinds of data warehouse environments and reporting tools that are available for doing that as well.
Yeah, so I think with that one, depending on whether you need it within Salesforce or if it can be outside of Salesforce. So here's a good question. What if you have 12 orgs and the financial aid office needs to log into 6 of the 12 orgs? Is that 6 separate licenses? Yes.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yes. I mean, I would depend on how those 12 orgs are set up, but if they truly needed access, they would need to have different licenses to access each of those orgs.
Yeah, I mean, there's of course the opportunity to do single sign-on across Salesforce orgs. So using a single login, somebody could get into different orgs. And even like in a higher ed situation, you could do that through some kind of federated ID. So your campus authentication system could be used for that. But that's just more from the user login side. In terms of actually, would that same user need that same license across all orgs? I mean, I think on the surface of it, yes, you would. But I'd say that's definitely a question to ask your Salesforce account executive to understand what your options are there.
All right, I have another question. We've got time. What are the costs related to moving from multiple orgs to a single org? could there be a situation where you start with similar functionality in multiple orgs that end up in a single org that services everyone across an institution?
I'll start, Virginia, but I'll definitely want to hear from you on this as well. I mean, I think if I was trying to jot that down as you were talking. I mean, I think that you know, yes, definitely there are situations where you know, where today you have many orgs, and you would be better served by consolidating that into a single org. You know, from our perspective, you know, that it has to be done with care. You know, to minimize disruption to the things people are doing day to day, and you know, and to be sure you've kind of again gone through these different considerations and make sure that you're comfortable with whatever the trade-offs are going to be, and then you know, treat it like an implementation project, where you've got a project manager and you've got a timeline and a plan that you're executing against. And you know, that's going to involve data migration, and you know, you may have to rebuild certain integrations that have been built with those other orgs. So it's, you know, generally it's not going to be trivial unless your orgs are pretty lightweight. So you know, it's definitely going to require planning, and again, I think a roadmap would be an appropriate first step to helping make sure you're charting the right course for that consolidation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, there would definitely be a need for re-implementation work to support that. Okay, I've got one more question. How does one implement the coordination between orgs? Oh, I think we answered this one in another question. How does one implement the coordination between orgs in the coordination model? And I think we covered that.
Yeah.
We talked through multiple. Okay, we've got that one. All right, here is a good question. Do you need to have a center of excellence if you have multiple orgs? You don't have to, but we would highly recommend that you do have a governing body that sits over the orgs and actively monitors and makes decisions about processes, procedures, best practices, brings the user community together to address issues and concerns, evaluates future releases, future functionality that may be coming down the road, additional apps that are needed. So it would be highly recommended. Would you agree, Watt?
Yeah, I think so. I'd also maybe ask the question differently, which would be, do you only need a center of excellence if you have multiple orgs? Do you think, Virginia, a center of excellence is still a good idea if you even only have one org?
Great question, and I would think yes. I would say yes when you're working across the enterprise. So when you have a single org that has all of your departments, whether it be from, you know, recruitment all the way through advancement, you need a governing body sitting over that to help resolve issues, you know, address configuration concerns, integrations, all of those types of things. So I would say yes, yeah, from an enterprise perspective. There is another question we have about the marketing cloud. Where did it go? I'm sorry. What if I have marketing cloud? Can I connect it to two orgs? And the answer is yes, you can connect the marketing cloud to two Salesforce instances. And it's something that we're actively doing now for several of our clients. And so if there were more questions around that, we'd be happy to address those with you. And the last question that I'm seeing here is, can we use Salesforce to integrate two orgs?
Yeah, so Salesforce to Salesforce is has been around a while as a mechanism that's the platform provides for connecting and sharing data between orgs. I would say it really depends on the use case as to whether that's going to be sufficient. It's really, I think, it's primarily designed for situations where you've got two sales organizations that want to share data about customers with one another. And so, again, depending on one's usage of Salesforce, that could be viable. And again, it kind of comes with the platform. So certainly would be something worth investigating. But in general, for the kinds of uses that higher ed and nonprofits make of Salesforce, which is beyond just kind of accounts and contacts and opportunities into much more complicated data models, I think it's generally going to take something more than Salesforce to Salesforce to satisfy that ability to share the right kinds of data across your different orgs.
And then here's a question, Watt. What if I already have a number of Salesforce orgs already? How do I decide if and how to consolidate? And that's a tricky question. I think part of it would be going through much of what we discussed today to determine the how and when to do that.
Right. I mean, I think, in some cases, organizations, institutions have multiple Salesforce organizations, multiple Salesforce orgs by design. They planned it out that way, and that's and there was thought given to it, and that's the right model for them. But in probably more cases, it tends to be multiple orgs by default, meaning those things have grown up organically over time, and now you're in a place where you're trying to figure out if it's the right model or not. So yeah, I would agree. Kind of walking through the consideration areas that we've covered in this presentation, and having those conversations internally to understand priorities and timeline and budget, and kind of just internal capacity to work together out of if not a single org, out of fewer orgs. It's going to go a long way towards getting you on the right path.
All right, great. So it doesn't look like there's any other questions coming through. So thank you all very much. If there aren't any more, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. We very much appreciate you attending today. There will be a recording sent out probably by tomorrow of this, and certainly you have our contact information, both Watt and myself, to reach out and ask us any questions or anything else that we can provide. We'd be happy to do so. Watt, thanks so much.
Thank you, Virginia. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye.